Hello Year 9, Mrs. Evans here. I've been given the task of taking you through some of Edgar Allan Poe's poetry to go alongside your study of the Gothic this half term. We're going to have a look at The Raven, and I know that you've already started having a look at this poem. It was one of the texts for the project, but you've only had a look at the beginning of the poem, so I'm going to go back through that with you to consolidate what you've learned, and then we're going to extend that learning and provide a little bit of challenge to take you to the next step. You might want to familiarise yourself with the poem. You have a copy of that as part of your project. So if you would like to pause the video and go and have a read back through The Raven, or watch the Simpsons clip. The Simpsons a few years ago did a parody of this poem for their Halloween special. So go and have a look at that to familiarise yourself with the ideas and even just the story or the narrative of the poem. Okay, we're going to begin the lesson with a quick task, just like we do always, a low stakes test. Now, you've been doing your project work and maybe doing your own reading around the Gothic these last few weeks. And I'd like you've got 2 minutes, so time yourself, get those phones out or your watches out and time yourself for 2 minutes. Can you list as many Gothic features as you can? Okay, you should have come up with a list that looks a little bit like this. So things are Gothic tropes. Now tropes is just another word for a common feature, something that's used a lot in a literary text. So that's a key word for us. I'm going to put that there. If you would like to write down the keywords as you go, we should have quite a list before the end of the lesson. The things that you could have come up with for that are Gothic tropes, things that we see a lot in the Gothic genre, are mystery and fear, settings such as graveyards or castles, monsters, a villain or an anti-hero, somebody that has a moral decay or becomes a bad guy as the text goes on. You've got things like the supernatural, and we're going to come back and have a look at that in a bit. Things like vampires, werewolves. There's omens and curses, nightmares and dreams, emotional distress. The list goes on. So you should have had things like that in your quick task there. Okay, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. As I've asked you to do before, to familiarise yourself with the poem, just to get the story back into the forefront. And obviously the title is really important. We wouldn't really be doing this poem a service if we didn't have a think about the title. Why The Raven? So I want you to ask yourself that question now. Just a minute or so to think about what sort of things people usually associate with the raven. Remember, the raven is that bird down in the bottom right there. It looks a bit like a crow. It's all black with black plumage or black feathers. And what sort of things do people usually associate with ravens? And why do you think a Gothic writer might include a raven in their work? 1 minute to kind of write down some ideas. Okay, so a raven, the kind of things you might have come up with because of their black plumage or their feathers, and the fact that they eat something called carrion. Carrion is dead meat. Is that they are an ill omen, or something that's quite an ominous sign. If you see a raven, it's not really maybe a good sign of things to come. They're associated with loss and death, and even sometimes death himself, so death personified. You've all maybe heard of the Grim Reaper with his black cloak and his big scythe, and sometimes ravens are associated with that as well. So if we see the raven in a literary text, it's usually used as a symbol that it is not really a good sign. It's going to be quite a dark tone to the text. The fact that the raven is a talking bird as well, though, it maybe is linked to, so something slightly different, something slightly new that you might not know, is that it's linked to also like prophecies or giving some insight into something. So being able to tell us something or illuminate something. And that's also something to keep in mind as we go through the poem. Okay, so we're going to consolidate your learning, the learning that was set on the project based on this poem, to have a look at the beginning. Before we move on though, add symbolism to your keyword list. So very quick summary of the poem here. It is midnight on a cold evening in December in the 1840s. So written a long time ago. In a dark and shadowy bedroom, there's wood burning in the fireplace as a man laments. That means that he is feeling very sad for or grieving for the death of a lady called Lenore, a woman who he deeply loved. To occupy his mind, he's trying to he's reading a few stories just to take his mind off it. And when he's reading the stories, he hears a tapping noise on the door. When he opens the door, he sees nothing but darkness. And then after he's shut the door again, the tapping keeps going. He opens the shutter of the window and he discovers a raven. A raven then flies into the room and lands above his door on a bust. So that's like a statue of just the head and the shoulders of Athena. Now, she's called Pallas in the poem. This is the goddess of wisdom, and that might link to the raven when we've just been talking about the symbolism of a raven, and its links to prophecies and insight and knowledge. And all it says to the speaker in the poem, whenever he's asked a question, is the word nevermore. So just a brief overview of that, just to remind you of the narrative. Remember, the narrative means the story. And if you'd like to add that to your keyword, you can do now, your keywords list. Right, so we're just going to consolidate the learning now. How does Poe immediately establish a Gothic atmosphere? You should have already done this task. So it's just a case of just reminding ourselves of the type of things that we should have come up with. Reminding ourselves about Gothic tropes or common features. And so we're asking ourselves, how does Poe immediately establish a Gothic atmosphere? And there, the first couple of stanzas there. Stanza, remember, is a verse in poetry. So if you'd like to add that to your keywords, do so now. So some of the things that you might have come up with then. Having a look at this quotation here, midnight dreary. So once upon a midnight dreary. If we're going to think about the word how, that means that Poe is using something. He is using or employing a method to convey or communicate an idea to the reader. And here, Poe is using the setting of midnight dreary. So I'd like you to think about yourself like why midnight dreary would be Gothic. So pause the video and have a little think. Right, so the kind of ideas that you should have come up with here are the idea that at midnight, it's the middle of the night, isn't it? The clue's in the word there. So with midnight, we associate darkness. And in the darkness, it's a frightening time. It's all about the dangerous times and the unknown. Things happen at nighttime to frighten us. So Poe's used nighttime as a setting there to make it a dangerous atmosphere. It also links to the idea of the supernatural. Now, the supernatural just means unnatural. It's another word for unnatural. So things that are not of this world. And commonly in stories, and particularly in the Gothic, things like werewolves or vampires, or monsters, they all appear at nighttime or emerge at nighttime. This is really important. You might not have looked at this idea, but he also tells us that the speaker in the first person tells us anyway, that he was nodded, nearly napping. So he doesn't mean that he's nodding by nodding his head as if to say yes. What he means there is that he's falling asleep. He's somewhere between sleep and awake. Now, this is a really important feature or a Gothic trope because Gothic writers often use dreams or nightmares to convey their ideas or show their ideas to their readers. When we're asleep, this is where we feel our emotions heightened. So imagine yourself remember what it's like to have a nightmare, and you wake from that nightmare feeling, in a cold sweat, or your heart might be beating really fast, and you think, that was really, really vivid. It really made me feel quite frightened. Because our emotions are heightened when we sleep, and that's a way, and that could be joy as well. It doesn't have to be a nightmare, or terror. But obviously Gothic writers use nightmares quite a lot to heighten the emotions or increase the emotions that the speaker is feeling. And here he's in between of being awake and being asleep. So it makes the reader question whether or not this actually happened, or whether or not this just happened in his dreams or in his subconscious when he's not awake. So it takes us away from reality a little bit. So that might have been a feature that you missed. And if you look at any Gothic texts in the future, think about maybe whether or not the writers use dreams and how they've used dreams there. Also linking back to the setting as well, the idea of the bleak December. A setting, bleak, it's cold. December is a winter month, so it's a month of decay and death, and we're all looking forward to the spring by the time we get to December. Well, I know I certainly am anyway. And then finally, the ghost idea as well, bringing in this idea of the supernatural, the paranormal, something that is not of this world. So very, very quickly, so that's a consolidation exercise to just talk through the ways in which Poe immediately tells us that this is a Gothic atmosphere. So before we move on, you need to add atmosphere, supernatural and subconscious to your list. Now we're going to take a closer look at a line, and I'd like us to start thinking about the tone Poe uses in this part of the poem. And the line of the poem I would like us to look at is, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrote its ghost upon the floor. And the question we're asking again is how? What methods? If you see the word how, it means what methods has the writer used to help us understand something? And here I want us to think about the melancholy tone. If you don't know what melancholy is, maybe have a look in the dictionary or a dictionary online to find out what that is now. You should have found out that melancholy means sadness. So we know why the speaker is feeling a sadness. It's because he's grieving for the woman that he loved. But how does this line make us understand? How does it make us understand that he is melancholy, that he's sad or grieving? Which bit of that quotation, because that's quite a long quotation to use, we wouldn't want to use that entire quotation. So which bit of that quotation from those couple of lines can we select as evidence for the poem's melancholy tone? And I want us to think about why that's the case. I want you to pause the video and explode that quotation, please. Right, what you should have come up with is this one. Separate dying ember wrote its ghost upon the floor. So an ember is a bit, from a fire, when the fire is dying, a part of the fire, and it says it's a dying ember there, wrote its ghost. Now, of course, that it's not really dying, it doesn't have a ghost, so this is what we call a metaphor. So Poe is using a metaphor to establish a melancholy tone or a sad tone. So why that metaphor? Well, the dying ember, because a fire usually symbolises hope and warmth and comfort, our speaker is not feeling those things. All of those things are leaving him. They're moving away or dying, as this metaphor is telling us. All of his hope, his love perhaps for Lenore is going away, is lost that hope. The ghost he might be talking about might be the ghost of the past that is now gone. It could be Lenore's ghost now that she is dead. It's still with him, but he can't be with her or love her in life. Have a look at the words bleak, dying and ghost as well. We call that a lexical field, don't we? Words that all link to the same idea. And here we have a lexical field of despair and sadness, a loss of joy, and in its place, no hope. So that's how he establishes a melancholy tone in that line, with that use of the metaphor and the choice of words or the lexical field he uses. And you might want to add those words to your keyword list. So we've got melancholy as a new word, and we've also got just metaphor. That's probably not a new word, but just something to add to our keywords list to remind us, because sometimes we miss metaphors and we might focus more on similes, but we don't want to just rely on similes all the time. We want to look for those metaphors too, because they're very, very commonly used by writers. Another part of the poem I would like to have a look at is this this stanza here. And remember, stanza is just a posh word for a verse in poetry. Now, you've read back through the poem, have another little look back through, or watch the Simpsons clip again. And this is taken from the middle of the poem, after the raven has come into the room, and it is standing on the bust of the goddess. And here we see, and it's hidden though, it's not necessarily as obvious as some of the other Gothic tropes or features, but here we can see a transgression. Now, a transgression is a very common feature of a Gothic text. It means when a speaker or a character steps over a boundary. So a boundary, it might be a moral boundary, it might be a knowledge boundary, it might be a religious boundary or a scientific boundary, but it's basically a line that we shouldn't be crossing. And in doing so, when they do cross, then it doesn't really always end well. And in this stanza, we see our speaker doing that. He says, "But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then, upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore." So he's already heard the raven say nevermore, or croak here. We've got a lovely use of onomatopoeia there, nevermore. But what is the transgression here? He's heard him say it, but what does the speaker want to do here? When does he overstep that mark? And basically, that's the shift into it not going really well. So pause the video and have a little think about that. You should have come up with this idea. The idea that the speaker listens to what the raven said when he says nevermore, but when he's not getting any more answers, it says that he straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of the bird. He says that he betook myself to linking, thinking what this ominous of bird meant in croaking nevermore. He becomes curious. Curious to understand why the raven's there. Instead of just ignoring the raven, he wants to know what he means, and he starts to question the raven again and again and again. So the transgression here is his curiosity, and he's overstepping that boundary. He wants to know, and he's not going to rest until he knows what the raven means. And again, this is a common feature of the Gothic. So when you come across Macbeth in the future, perhaps, you'll see how Macbeth is a bit of a Gothic text, actually, a very early Gothic text, in that he transgresses, he oversteps a boundary. I'm not going to spoil it for you. You have to wait till year 11 maybe to have a look at that text. In year 10 as well, you might have a look at Jekyll and Hyde. That's another Gothic text, and maybe there's a transgression there. And even when you go right up the way into A level and maybe start looking at Frankenstein perhaps, or other texts that are linked to the Gothic, transgressions are often at the heart of those texts. So you might want to add that to your keywords list now. And look, we've got a really good bank of keywords now. How many have we got on the list there? We've got 8 keywords on the list. Some of them are methods, some of them are just literary terms that we can start using in our written responses. So I would like to have a look here at how the tone of the poem, how does the tone of the poem change? After the speaker has overstepped the boundary and starts questioning the raven, as you know from reading the poem or watching the Simpsons clip, the raven says nothing apart from nevermore. That's the answer to his questions all of the time. And so the tone of the poem changes. It's melancholy at the beginning, so despair and loss of hope and very, very sad. And then at this part of the poem, it's very, very different though. He says, "Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Eden," that's just another word for Eden, the Garden of Eden there. And I'm not going to go on anymore. You can read that yourselves. And what I'd like you to think about at this point, and just pause the video to have a look at this, is what does it sound like now? Read it out to yourself or rewatch the Simpsons clip. How does the writer of the Simpsons, or how does the animator of the Simpsons make sure that we see that shift in tone? Shift, remember, is just a change in tone. So the type of things that you should have come up with here is that the tone is now not melancholy. The tone is now one of anger and a little bit of aggression actually. So he questions and questions the raven, he gets no answer, and so he loses his temper. But look, I haven't just asked you what the tone of the poem is, I've asked you how the tone of the poem changes. So we need to have a look at the methods that Edgar Allan Poe is using to help us understand that as a reader. Some of the things that you could have come up with here is he calls the raven a thing of evil, a devil, a fiend. So his anger is coming out in insults to the raven. He's insulting the raven here. You could have come up with, tell this soul, get thee back, leave no black plume, leave my loneliness. He starts to use imperatives to command the raven to do something. He's trying to take back control through that anger. And the verb there, so it's starting using our literary terms, the verb I shrieked also tells us that it's very much different from the melancholy tone he was using at the beginning here. He is shouting. When you're shrieking, it's a bit like me in the classroom, isn't it? When you're shrieking, you're shouting almost as a scream. You're losing all control of yourself. So this is what we're talking about for when after the transgression he loses his temper. He's now not going to get any answers now, so he's got no peace at this part. He's even in more despair than he was at the beginning. At the beginning he was in despair, but he felt sadness for his loss. Here he's in despair because he now doesn't understand. He's not being given any answers. So he's in a worse position than he was at the beginning of the poem. So there's that use of that transgression there, but also very much the change in tone. So if you would like to add imperative and verb, just as a reminder to your list, we are now coming up with an excellent list, and we're going to just do a little bit of a low stakes test at the end on those. Finally, I want us to think about the end of the poem and go back to what the raven symbolises. Why does the reader feel sympathy for the speaker? So by the end of the poem, we feel sorry for the reader. We feel sorry for the speaker at the beginning of the poem because of his loss and his sense of loneliness and his melancholy. But at the end of the poem, we feel sympathy for the speaker as well. Edgar Allan Poe has created sympathy for the speaker. He says, "And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bus of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight over him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted never more. Very cleverly there, Poe has used nevermore, exactly what the raven was saying, right at the end of the poem there. So just pause the video, have a little think about that question. What does the raven symbolise? And then another question, why does the reader feel sympathy for the speaker? How is the speaker left? In what state is the speaker left in? Okay, some of the things that you should have come up with. The raven, going back to what we said at the beginning of the lesson about what ravens represent or symbolise in literature, it is loss, the death of something. Well, here at the end of the poem, the speaker is in a worse state, just like we said, because he transgressed, because he stepped over the boundary. He's in a worse place than he was at the beginning of the poem. The raven in the room is a constant reminder of loss. So he symbolises not only the loss of Lenore, the woman that he loved, he symbolises the loss of peace that the speaker will never feel again. The raven is there on the bust of Pallas or on the bust of the goddess above the door as a constant reminder that he's never going to feel joy or peace again, and that he's never going to get the answers that he wanted from the raven about life, about death. So the raven, like we said, is symbolising, he's prophesying this a different life for the speaker. And we feel extreme sympathy for him because he's not going to have any peace anymore. All he's going to have is loneliness and no answers to the questions that he's been asking. He was looking for it in books at the beginning, wasn't he? And he's not going to get it from the raven now. And the raven is never going to leave him. So that symbol of loss means it's never going to leave him. He's never going to feel peace. Okay. So last task for us to do is a low stakes test. And I would like you to cover up your keywords list. And then I'd like you to try and remember as many as we've gone through today and try and focus on the correct spelling of those as well. So have a quick little look, quick little reminder, pause the video, cover up your keywords and write down as many as you can remember from this little lesson. Okay, that's the end of the lesson year 9. I can't wait to see you all in September, whatever September might look like. The English department send you a huge hello, and we're hoping that all of your family and friends are safe and well. Bye now.